Welcome back to the Energy Sovereignty Project and the continuation of our closeout series. This video is going to be dedicated to driving on sunlight, and that was a very important aspect of the Energy Sovereignty Project. I know that quite a few of you have been waiting for this particular video. Well, for those that are just joining us, the Energy Sovereignty Project was set up to answer some key questions that I had, that I know many of you had, in regards to solar power and a sustainable future, driving on electricity, that type of a thing. And one of the main arguments that came up was that if everybody went to an electric vehicle, that it would crash the grid. There would be no way for the grid to withstand that amount of additional usage. And on the face of it, that argument is absolutely valid. You can't just simply double the amount of power used by every household and then expect the grid to be able to absorb that. And so as we went into the Energy Sovereignty Project, one of the things obviously that we wanted to make sure that we included was driving a vehicle on sunlight. And so let's go ahead and take a look at that by starting off the way we do with most of these closeout videos, looking at our year at a glance. And so right off the bat, you draw your attention to month 1, 2, and 12, January, February, and December. And during these months, our solar does not match or exceed the home's usage, and so obviously if we don't have enough solar power to run the home, we're not going to be doing any driving on sunlight either. And so the remainder of the year that you can see there, this driving on sunlight is folded into those blue lines. That's the home usage line. And because of that, our first task then is to extract those miles driven on sunlight from all of the home's regular usage. And to do that, we have our logs, and as you see on our example here from one of our typical logs, we've got the miles driven by the car, you've got the amount of power used by the home with the car power stripped out of it, and then also the amount of power that has gone to the vehicle and the miles driven on the car recorded from the odometer. And so that's basically our jumping off point for all of this. And so now that allows us to collect all that data, parse it in a way that then results in this, which is our total miles for the year broken down so that we can take a look at it. So the total miles traveled by the car in 2019 was 20,898.2 miles. But for those of you that have been following the Energy Sovereignty Project, you know that we took a 4,000 mile road trip to Minnesota last year, 3,998.2 miles to be exact. But because this video is focusing on the power burden for the home itself, I'm going to go ahead and just remove those miles from our total. It's fair to do that. You'll see later on, I'm going to make some similar adjustments for the months of October and July and go into a little more detail as to why we did that. But we are removing the Minnesota miles. So less the Minnesota trip, we drove 16,900 miles. If we average that out over the course of the year, we see that we average 46 miles a day. Our consumption rate of 32.7 kilowatt hours per 100 miles driven, that comes out to be a daily average burden on the home of 15 kilowatt hours per day. And again, we're giving you all these raw numbers and baselines so that you can make adjustments according to the size of your PV system, the efficiency of your vehicles, and then factor in what your local cost is for power if you were to purchase that that power. So the again, the total power from sunlight we managed to send to the car was 3,301 kilowatt hours, and that comes out to 10,095 miles at our consumption rate. And so overall then that leaves us with 6,805 miles, 2,225 kilowatt hours that had to be driven on power from other sources. And so how much of that 1,380 miles a month of a burden was covered by the home's solar. So for that, we go back to another version of our year in review, only this time what I'm going to show is the miles that were driven on the car just on sunlight. And that's what this is here. And this gives us a seasonal perspective over how much of our miles we were able to get from sunlight. And so here, you can see it's modified overview, broken down the miles by month. And remember, just because you don't see miles listed doesn't mean that miles weren't driven. On average, 46 miles were driven every day, regardless of whether those miles were driven on sunlight or not. And so then that gives us that average of 1,380 miles per month. So because we didn't record the actual mileage for January, February, much of March, and much of December, for those months, I'm going to measure that for the rest of the charts against that 1,380 mile average. And so that's going to give us a little on the high side, but again, we're going to keep it fair. And so when we do this, what we get for the percentages of the amount covered month by month is this. Basically, I'm going to call this 6 months that were driven pretty much 100% on solar. April, May, June, July, September, and October. And even though October, you can see there, it only shows 81% of our driving being covered, that last 20%, that represents mostly out-of-town driving. And so just like the removal of our trip to Minnesota, it isn't really fair to add that on because when we take a look at how much power we actually sent to the grid, we did 299.6 miles from supercharging and other sources away from the home. But in that same period, we sent 190 kilowatt hours, and that's enough to cover 581 miles to the grid. And so it wasn't the home's fault that we didn't cover those miles. We actually had plenty of power to spare. I just simply wasn't close enough to the home to be able to utilize it. And that's what we had talked about earlier. If you are driving further than 100 miles away, then your round trip may wind up exceeding the vehicle's ability to do that. And again, in our charts, we broke it out very cleanly as to how many miles we were able to drive off of power that we got from the sunlight and how many we had to get from other sources. And so that's what's presented there. And again, July is pretty much the same thing. At what we sent to the grid more than covers. Anyway, you get the idea. So the one thing that is interesting, pull this chart back up, if you look at the chart, is that August isn't one of the months that we were able to drive fully on sunlight. And so that was a bit of a fun surprise, and the reason that we do these tests, because sometimes these are the things that that you need to know. Well, in August, it was so hot that the production levels fell off. The panels become slightly less efficient, and then to top that off, you have a lot of AC usage, and then that wound up actually reducing our ability to drive on sunlight for that month. So we still covered all the home's needs, but as you see from the chart there, we only managed to cover about 50% of our driving. And so we'll go over August specifically here in just a minute. But so how much additional power would our household need to produce to be able to cover these shortfalls? That again goes back to that question that was asked, or rather that argument that was presented, that if everybody did this, if everybody started to drive electric, could the grid actually handle that that shortfall? Well, so to tackle that, let's take one last look at our annual chart, and we'll look at it in a little bit different way using the data again from the Energy Sovereignty Project logs. We're going to untangle what happened in August, and then we'll go ahead and apply that to the other months as well. And so when we tease out the data, the amount of the shortfall was taken from two data points. Firstly, from the amount of charge that was required for the car that could not be supplied by the home, but we also used the amount that the home needed to draw from the grid. And in August, that number should have been 0, but it wasn't. And again, well, to be fair, let's say that also that we did have a maintenance day on the 7th, and so I did make some minor correction for that. But that's not what caused the August disaster. What caused the reduction in output was the heat. The heat, as we said, caused the AC to operate nearly non-stop, and it also reduced the power output of the panels by about 8%. And so let's go ahead and divide this up. We had a total shortfall of driving miles for August of 892.2 miles, and that's 310 kilowatt hours. And the rest of the story behind that is that we also had a shortfall for the home. In other words, the home itself had to draw 72.9 kilowatt hours from the grid power, and so that gave us that total shortfall here of that 383 kilowatt hours that you see. And where it gets a little muddy is that we also sent 45.4 kilowatt hours to the grid for the month of August. So from a dollars and cents perspective, this counts because of net metering, because we were then able to get a credit for that. But I'm not going to include that credit in what we're talking here. Again, in the name of fairness, what we're looking at is we're looking to try and figure out what is the total burden on the grid for somebody who would try and run their vehicle or vehicles off of the grid. And so we're not going to count the amount that we sent to the grid. We're only going to look at the negatives. And so as long as, like I said, you have net metering, you can go ahead and apply that. But the other thing to note about net metering is it's probably going away. It will be replaced maybe with something else if you wind up having things like vehicle to grid, or you wind up having the ability of your home batteries to supply power to the grid to help them out. So there might be some other cost schemes in there that will work in your favor to replace net metering. But net metering, I just don't see that as being scalable as we move forward, and you'll see why in a second here. And so here is what we wind up with when we do that for the rest of the months. Boom, we get this. So, don't grab your chest just yet. Let me explain some of these numbers a little bit that you're seeing here. This chart is designed to show you the total load on the grid. And I'm doing this to get you all to fully understand what the trade-off is when you go from gasoline to electric. And so I don't think that any of the other channels are doing this. That's why you're here. We're kind of going into this deep dive on this. But this chart makes absolutely no allowance for sending power to the grid. What I'm trying to illustrate here is what happens when everybody shifts to electric vehicle transport. Now, we hear this argument all the time. If everybody would load the grid, it'll crash. Well, now you get to forward them this page and show them exactly what that really looks like. So what you see here is a worst case scenario. And the first thing that I'm going to point out is that even though our solar output was reduced in the winter months, at no time was it 0. So it did offset the usage a little. And so, and as we're looking at how much we were able to operate without touching the grid, that's where you can see again those numbers in green. So let you take a quick look at that a second. And so the thing to note here as you're looking this over is that prior to our solar installation, the home used approximately 30 kilowatt hours a day, and at that rate our normal use for any given month would be 900 kilowatt hours. So as you're looking at this, let that resonate with you for a moment. A household today of equal size would consume 900 kilowatt hours off the grid per month, and they would be doing all their driving on gasoline. So what you notice here then on the chart is that at no time did we use over 900 or even as much as 900 kilowatt hours. And so, yeah, that's with a 46 mile per day average vehicle use, and your vehicle use might be higher, and if that's the case, then you're welcome to kind of move these numbers around and see how much your shortfall would be, and figure out where in the year those shortfalls would occur. But what you see is exactly what we saw. We gave up gasoline to the tune of 16,000 miles a year, and we didn't increase our energy consumption of the home over and above what the home used before we got solar. In fact, we're still running a little light, a little less power consumed than before we even got solar at all. And so one last thing before we go, I'm going to go ahead and take this chart that you just saw and make it a little more digestible, and I'm going to break this down in consumption per day on for those periods. And let's pull this up here. And so now, as you're looking at this, comparing it to your own systems, you see here for December, we were 14 kilowatts per day production. And so now this gives you a way to try and see how much larger your system might need to be in order to cover that shortfall, in part or total. And so even with that 14 kilowatt hour per day production, we wind up still having a shortfall of 27 kilowatt hours a day. Now our system is 10.2 kilowatts of solar production. If we were to double that, the way that math works is that we would then take that additional 14 kilowatt hours per day of production and subtract that from that deficit. And so then that winds up giving us a deficit of 13 kilowatt hours per day. And so that just kind of gives you an idea of where the manufacturers might need to go. If you're producing a solar roof, if you're producing more efficient solar panels, that what we're really looking at for a home of our size to cover more of our needs, you're looking at something in the 20 kilowatt range of production. And so will that be possible? Yeah, I expect that probably will be possible in the future. But even as it stands now, what you can see from this is that adding an electric vehicle, as long as you have the solar and the batteries to be able to support it, it's not going to crash the grid. The grid will be fine. Now, one thing that I kind of opened up with, we're talking about everybody moving to solar power. So I know a lot of people that have electric vehicles, but I actually know very few people that don't have solar that have electric vehicles. Now, obviously, if you're in an apartment building or something, then that's a discussion maybe that folks will ultimately have to have with their homeowners association in the case of some kind of a high-rise or condominium situation. But the addition of the batteries is what really makes this work. And so that's going to be kind of our takeaway for this, that while the home is charging while you're at work, you need someplace to put that power. If you just send it out the grid, then we're back to that initial argument of the grid will crash as being a legitimate argument, because we can't work the grid. We can't rely, at least currently, we can't rely on the grid doing that until the power suppliers, until the utility companies actually supply local batteries that aren't necessarily in your house. And I won't harp on that too much. We've had this discussion. I'm thinking that the future moving forward is going to wind up being a hybrid solution where most homes will have some of the battery power at the home, and there will be some local storage, whether that's provided by your subdivision or by your utility company. So we'll see how this works. And so I hope you enjoyed that. I hope this helped you visualize how this works in a 21st century utility grid environment. No, you're not going to crash the grid if you add electric vehicles, so long as you have the solar and the batteries local to support it. So as always, the best of luck with your own systems, and we'll see you soon with a couple more of these closeout videos.